The morning Simon Wallace rode into Cedar Hollow, the wind carried the smell of scorched iron and grief, and he would later say that was how he first knew Maria Sawyer before he ever saw her face. It was the spring of 1878, in the Wyoming Territory, where the grass had not yet forgotten winter and the cattle still huddled close for warmth. Cedar Hollow was a scattering of clapboard buildings pressed against the foothills, home to perhaps 200 souls, a saloon, a mercantile, a small white church, and one blacksmith shop that had, until 3 months prior, rung with the hammer strikes of a man named Thomas Sawyer. Thomas had died in February, crushed beneath a wagon wheel he had been repairing when the jack gave way. He left behind no children, only a wife of 6 years, 26 years old, with calloused hands and a spine of iron that the town had not yet come to understand. Maria Sawyer had buried her husband in the frozen ground behind the church, and 3 days later she had opened the forge doors and lit the fire herself. The town had expected her to sell the shop, or better yet, to marry again quickly, as widows in that country so often did, for a woman alone was thought to be a woman in danger, and a woman in danger was thought to be a woman who needed a man's name to hide behind. But Maria Sawyer had looked at the anvil her husband left behind, black and cold, and had decided that she would rather ruin her hands than ruin her pride. She was not skilled, not at first. Her horseshoes came out lopsided, her hinges did not swing true, and more than once she burned her forearm badly enough to leave a scar shaped like a crescent moon just above her wrist. But she was stubborn in the way that only grief can make a person stubborn, and by April she was turning out work that men grudgingly admitted was passable, and by May, work that some admitted was good. It was into this town, in the dust of a Tuesday afternoon in June, that Simon Wallace arrived, leading a limping bay gelding whose front shoe had come half loose and torn a gash into the frog of its hoof. Simon was 31 years old, a drifting cattleman who had spent the better part of a decade moving from one outfit to another across Kansas, Nebraska, and now Wyoming, never quite settling, never quite explaining why. He had a quiet way about him, the kind that made men trust him with their herds and made women wonder what sorrow lived behind his eyes. He wore a gray hat gone soft with weather, and a Colt Peacemaker on his hip that he had fired only twice in anger in all his years, both times to save his own life and not to take another's. He led his horse toward the sound of hammer on iron, and when he stepped through the open doors of the forge, he stopped as though he had walked into a church mid-sermon. Maria Sawyer stood at the anvil with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, sweat darkening the collar of her work shirt, her dark hair pulled back beneath a leather cap to keep it from the sparks. She did not look up right away. She was finishing a weld, her hammer falling in even practice strokes, and Simon found himself watching the muscles of her forearm work beneath sun-browned skin, thinking that he had never in his life seen a woman look so entirely certain of herself. "You planning to stand there gawking," she said without turning, "or did you bring me business?" Simon cleared his throat. "My horse threw a shoe about 2 miles back, tore up the frog some. I was told this was the only smith for 20 miles. "It is." She set down her hammer and turned to face him, wiping her hands on a rag that hung from her belt. Her eyes were dark brown, sharp, and unflinching, and Simon had the distinct impression that she was measuring him the way a man might measure another man before a card game. "Bring him in. I will need to look at that hoof before I can shoe him." "Yes, ma'am." "I am not old enough to be anyone's ma'am," she said, though there was no real heat in it, only the tired reflex of a woman who had heard the word too many times from men trying to be polite while deciding whether they trusted her. "Maria Sawyer, this is my shop. Simon Wallace," he tipped his hat. "I mean no disrespect, only good manners. Manners I can use, disrespect I cannot." She gestured toward the horse. "Bring him around back, there is more light." He did as she asked, and for the better part of an hour he watched her work, cleaning the wound with a practiced hand, packing it with pine tar, and finally fitting a new shoe with a precision that surprised him. She talked as she worked, not out of nervousness, but out of the easy habit of a person accustomed to filling silence with useful words, telling him where the wound had likely come from, how long the horse should rest before hard riding, what feed would help the hoof grow strong again. Simon found himself listening less to the words and more to the low, steady confidence beneath them. "You did not learn this from watching," he said finally. "This is proper smithing. My husband taught me some before he died." Her hand stilled for just a moment on the horse's leg and then continued their work as though she had simply chosen not to let grief slow her down. "The rest I taught myself, books mostly and a great deal of burned metal. I am sorry for your loss. Everyone is." She straightened, resting a hand against the small of her back. "Sorry does not keep a shop open. Work does." There was something in the way she said it, flat and unadorned, that told Simon this was not bitterness but simple fact, a truth she had made peace with the way a person makes peace with weather. He respected that more than he could easily explain. "How much do I owe you?" he asked. $2 for the shoe and the tar. If you want, you can also pay by helping me haul that pile of scrap iron out back into the shed before the rain comes. My arm is tired and the sky does not look kind." Simon glanced up. Clouds were indeed building over the mountains, dark and swollen. "I can do that." "I was not really asking," she said, and for the first time the corner of her mouth lifted into something that was almost a smile. They worked together for the better part of another hour, hauling twisted iron and broken wagon parts into the shed just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. By the time they finished, both of them were soaked through, laughing at some small disaster involving a dropped wheel rim that had nearly taken Simon's boot with it, and something in the air between them had shifted, quiet and unspoken, the way the first crack of light shifts a dark room. "You are welcome to wait out the storm in the shop," Maria said, pushing wet hair from her face. "I have coffee, though I will warn you it is strong enough to warp iron. I have drunk worse on cattle drives. Then you will feel right at home." They sat together near the forge, which still held its heat even with the fire banked low, and Maria poured coffee into 2 tin cups while the rain hammered the roof above them. It was, Simon would later think, one of the strangest and most comfortable hours of his life, sitting in a blacksmith's shop with a widow he had known less than a day, talking as though they had known each other for years. She told him in pieces about Thomas, about the accident, about the weeks after when the town had circled her like buzzards, some out of pity and some out of something far less kind. "There is a man named Harlan Voss," she said, her voice going careful in a way it had not been before. "He owns the largest ranch this side of the river, nearly 6,000 head of cattle. He came to me not 2 weeks after Thomas was buried and offered to buy the shop." "What did you tell him?" "I told him it was not for sale." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "He came back a month later and offered again, this time for less money. When I refused again, he told me that a woman alone could not hope to keep a business running, and that ranchers would soon stop bringing their horses to a shop run by a widow who did not know her place." Simon felt something tighten in his chest, an old and familiar anger at the particular cruelty of men who mistook grief for weakness. "And did they stop?" "Some did." Her jaw set. "Enough that I have had lean months. But others kept coming, out of loyalty to Thomas, or because my work was cheaper, or simply because they did not care whose hands did the shoeing so long as the shoes held. I have survived 4 months. I intend to survive many more." "I believe you will," Simon said, and he meant it entirely. She looked at him then, really looked, as though surprised to hear the words spoken with such plain conviction rather than the polite doubt she had grown used to. "Most men tell me I am foolish. Most men are afraid of women who do not need them," Simon said. "I have never much cared for that kind of fear." The rain went on for another hour, and by the time it broke, something had settled between them that neither one named aloud, but both carried away when Simon finally led his mended horse back out onto the muddy road toward the ranch where he had taken on work for the season, a modest spread called the Broken Wheel, owned by an aging rancher named Elias Prout, who who was glad for an extra hand and asked few questions. Simon told himself he had no reason to return to Cedar Hollow any time soon. He told himself this for exactly 4 days, until an excuse presented itself in the form of a saddle strap that did not truly need repairing, and he found himself once more standing in the doorway of Maria Sawyer's forge. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm neither of them had planned, but both came to treasure. Simon found reasons, sometimes flimsy ones, to ride the 2 miles into town, and Maria found herself, more often than she would admit, glancing toward the road when she heard hoofbeats, hoping. He helped her lift heavy stock when his work at the broken wheel allowed it. She, in turn, mended a torn coat sleeve for him with a needle and thread she kept for just such purposes, insisting it was payment for his hauling and nothing more, though the careful, unhurried way she worked the stitches suggested otherwise. It was during one of these visits, in the last week of June, that Harlan Voss rode into town with 3 of his hired men, and Simon happened to be at the forge when he did. Harlan Voss was a broad man in his 50s, with a heavy gray mustache and a way of sitting his horse that suggested he believed the entire territory belonged to him by simple virtue of his wealth. His ranch, the Voss Cattle Company, ran nearly 6,000 head across land he had acquired through a combination of legitimate purchase and less legitimate pressure on smaller homesteaders who could not afford to fight him in court. He dismounted in front of the forge with the unhurried confidence of a man who did not expect to be refused, and his eyes found Maria immediately. "Mrs. Sawyer," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "I trust the shop is treating you well." "Well enough, Mr. Voss. I have come with a new offer." He glanced briefly at Simon, dismissing him as a hired hand not worth his attention. "Better than my last. I am prepared to pay you $800 for this shop, the tools, and the land it sits on. That is more than fair, and it would allow you to live comfortably in town without the burden of this work." "I did not ask to be relieved of a burden," Maria said. "This shop is not for sale, Mr. Voss. I have told you this before." Something flickered across Harlan's face, a brief tightening that suggested he was not accustomed to hearing that word from a woman twice in the same conversation. "You understand, I hope, that my ranch alone sends you a fair portion of your business. If that business were to go elsewhere, I imagine your circumstances might grow considerably harder." "Are you threatening to take your business elsewhere, Mr. Voss, or are you threatening something else entirely?" The directness of the question seemed to catch him off guard. He recovered quickly, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I am simply a businessman offering good sense to a woman who might not have considered all her options. There is no shame in accepting help, Mrs. Sawyer." "There is no help in an offer meant to frighten me into agreement," Maria said. "I will thank you to take your business to whichever smith pleases you, Mr. Voss, and to leave the offering of good sense to those who have not already made up their minds." Harlan's jaw tightened, and for a moment Simon thought the man might say something truly ugly, but instead he simply replaced his hat, gave a curt nod, and turned back toward his horse. Before mounting, however, his eyes cut once more toward Simon. "You would do well," he said, "to remind your friend here that widows who stand alone against men of means rarely fare well in this territory. Accidents happen. Fires happen. I would hate to see this shop suffer either." It was said lightly enough that a man could later claim it was no threat at all, merely an observation, but Simon heard the weight beneath it, and he saw the way Maria's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the hammer she still held. "Was that a threat, Mr. Voss?" Simon asked quietly. "Merely a fact of the world, Mr. Wallace. Simon Wallace. Mr. Wallace." Harlan mounted his horse with the ease of a man who had spent his whole life being obeyed. "A fact of the world is not a threat. It is simply true. Good day to you both." He rode off with his men trailing behind him, and the silence they left behind was heavy enough that Maria set down her hammer entirely and pressed both hands flat against the cooling anvil, as though steadying herself. "He has said things like that before," she admitted. "Never quite so plainly." "I do not like it," Simon said. Neither do I, but I will not sell this shop to a man who thinks a threat is the same as an offer. Simon studied her for a long moment, the stubborn set of her shoulders, the way her chin lifted even as her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "No," he said, "I do not suppose you will." It was in that moment, watching her refuse to bend beneath a rich man's veiled threat, that Simon Wallace understood he was no longer simply enjoying the company of an interesting woman. He was falling in love with her, slowly and completely, the way a man falls asleep beside a fire he did not intend to sit near for so long. Over the following weeks, Harlan Voss's pressure did not relent, though it took subtler forms. Two of his ranch hands were seen loudly proclaiming in the saloon that Maria Sawyer's work was shoddy, unreliable, unfit for serious ranchers, despite the fact that her horseshoes had never once failed a customer. A rumor began to circulate that she had cursed her husband's death upon herself through some manner of witchery, an old and cruel slander meant to isolate a woman men could not otherwise control. Someone left a dead crow nailed to her shop door one morning, a message clear enough that even those who pretended otherwise understood its meaning. Maria took the crow down herself, buried it behind the shop without a word, and opened for business as though nothing at all had happened, though Simon noticed the shadows beneath her eyes had grown darker in the days that followed. It was around this time that Maria decided, in the stubborn and practical way that defined so much of her character, that she would register her own cattle brand. The idea came to her almost by accident, during a conversation with an old rancher named Wendell Cross, one of the few men in the territory who had never wavered in his loyalty to her shop. "You ought to think about running a small herd of your own," Wendell told her one afternoon, while she reshod his mare. "There is good grazing land just north of your property that nobody has claimed. You could run 20, 30 head without much trouble, and it would give you income beyond the forge, something steadier in the lean months." "I know nothing of ranching, Wendell. You knew nothing of blacksmithing either, as I recall, and now half the county rides on shoes you made with your own hands." He smiled beneath his gray mustache. "A woman with your stubbornness could learn cattle easy enough." The idea took root slowly, the way good ideas often do, growing through the following weeks until Maria found herself unable to shake it. She began asking Simon questions during his visits, about grazing patterns, about branding, about the costs of a small starter herd. And Simon, who had spent a decade working cattle and knew the business better than almost anyone in the territory, found himself answering with growing enthusiasm, until eventually he was drawing rough maps in the dirt outside her shop, showing her which parcels of unclaimed land held the best water access. "You are serious about this," he said one evening in early August, watching her study the map he had drawn. "I am tired of depending entirely on men's horses needing shoes to keep this shop alive," she said. "If I have my own herd, my own brand, I answer to no one. Not Harlan Voss, not any man who thinks a widow's business is a temporary inconvenience to be waited out. A herd needs land, Maria. Land needs defending, especially against a man like Voss who has made a habit of pushing out smaller operations. Then I will need to learn to defend it." She looked up at him, something fierce and bright in her dark eyes. "Will you teach me?" Simon felt his heart do something complicated in his chest, some mixture of pride and fear, and a deep, aching tenderness he had not expected to feel so soon after his own solitary years on the trail. "I will teach you everything I know," he said. "Though I warn you, cattle do not care how stubborn a person is. They will still wander off simply to spite you." "Then we are well matched," Maria said, "for I have been told I have the same habit." The registration of a brand in the Wyoming territory in 1878 was not a complicated legal matter, though it was one that carried significant weight in a country where cattle theft was punished harshly, and a registered brand was often the only proof of ownership a rancher possessed. Maria rode to the county recorder's office in the nearby town of Larkspur, a journey of nearly a full day, with Simon accompanying her both for protection, and though neither said it aloud, for the simple pleasure of her company on the long ride. She designed the brand herself, a task she took to with the same careful precision she brought to her smithing. After several failed sketches, she settled on a mark that combined a stylized horseshoe with a small flame beneath it, a tribute both to the forge that had saved her and to the fire that had, in its own strange way, forged her into someone new. "The Flameshoe brand," Simon said, studying her final sketch as they sat together outside the recorder's office, waiting their turn. "It suits you. It suits what I intend to become," she corrected. "Not simply a blacksmith's widow anymore, something else entirely." The recorder, an elderly man named Otis Grimm, raised his eyebrows when Maria stated her intention but processed the paperwork without argument. For the law made no distinction between a man's brand and a woman's, so long as the fee was paid, and the mark did not conflict with an existing registration. "You are aware," Otis said as he stamped the final document, "that Harlan Voss's Circle V brand runs cattle in that same northern grazing area you have described." "I am aware," Maria said. "He will not be pleased." "Mr. Grimm," Maria said, folding the newly stamped paper and tucking it carefully into her satchel, "I have found that very little pleases Harlan Voss besides having his own way in all things. I do not intend to let that stop me from having mine." The ride home was quiet, but it was the comfortable quiet of two people who had shared something meaningful and did not need words to acknowledge it. Somewhere along that dusty road, beneath a sky turning orange with the last of the summer sun, Simon reached over and took Maria's hand, and she did not pull away. "I should tell you," Simon said, his voice rougher than he intended, "that I have not felt this way about anyone since before I left Kansas." "What happened in Kansas?" Maria asked, for it was the first time he had spoken of any life before the trail. Simon was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I was engaged once to a girl named Sarah Whitfield. We were young, only 19 and 20. Her family did not approve of a cattleman's son with no land of his own, and they sent her east to live with an aunt before we could marry. I never saw her again. I heard, some years later, that she had married a merchant in Ohio and seemed happy enough. I told myself I would not let my heart get tangled up again, not after that, and for 10 years I kept that promise well enough. And now I have met a woman who forges her own horseshoes and registers her own cattle brand, and refuses to be frightened by a man with 6,000 head of cattle and no decency to speak of," Simon said. "I find my old promise does not seem to matter so much anymore." Maria's fingers tightened around his. "I loved my husband," she said quietly. "I do not say that to wound you, only so you understand the truth of me. Thomas was a good man, and I grieved him honestly, and some part of me will always carry that grief. But grief is not the same as loneliness, and I have been lonely a long while now, long before he died, if I am honest, for a marriage can be lonely too in its own quiet ways. What I feel when I am with you, Simon, does not feel like betrayal of that grief. It feels like something new growing up alongside it. I would never ask you to forget him." "I know," she said. "That is precisely why I do not feel afraid to let myself feel this." They rode the rest of the way in a silence that felt, for the first time in months, entirely peaceful. The trouble began in earnest 3 weeks later, in early September, when the first small herd of cattle Maria had purchased, 18 head bought with savings scraped together from months of smithing work and a small loan from Wendell Cross, was discovered scattered, and several head short after a night of heavy rain. Simon found the broken fence line first, on a morning ride to check the herd before his own work at the broken wheel. The rails had not simply fallen, they had been deliberately pried apart, the nails pulled clean rather than broken, work no storm could have done. He rode immediately to tell Maria, finding her already at the forge despite the early hour, and watched her face go pale and then hard as granite as he explained what he had found. "How many head are missing?" "I counted 11 still in the pasture further down near the creek. That leaves 7 unaccounted for." 7 cattle do not simply vanish, Simon. No, he agreed. They do not. They rode out together to survey the damage, and it did not take long to find tracks leading north, toward Voss land, tracks that had been made by cattle driven deliberately rather than cattle that had wandered on their own. "We should go to the sheriff," Simon said, "and tell him what? That I suspect Harlan Voss stole my cattle, with no proof beyond tracks that any lawyer worth his salt would say could belong to any herd in the county." Maria's jaw was tight with fury and something close to despair. "Voss owns half the county already, Simon. Sheriff Tate would not risk crossing him over the word of a widow blacksmith. Then we find proof." It took 4 days of careful, quiet work, riding the boundary lines during hours when Voss's hired men were occupied elsewhere, before Simon finally spotted what they needed. 3 of Maria's cattle, bearing the unmistakable Flameshoe brand on their left flank, grazing openly within a fenced pasture belonging to the Voss Cattle Company, their brand only partially altered by a crude attempt to burn a circle V mark over top, an alteration so recent the burn had not even fully healed. "That is a hanging offense in most territories," Simon said grimly, studying the cattle from a safe distance through a small spyglass he had borrowed from Elias Prout. "Brand alteration is theft, plain and clear, no matter how you dress it up. Then let us bring the sheriff proof he cannot ignore." Sheriff Amos Tate was a heavy-set man in his 40s who had held his position for nearly 6 years, largely because he was competent enough not to embarrass himself, and cautious enough never to seriously anger the men whose support kept him in office. When Maria and Simon rode into his office with their account of altered brands, he listened with visible discomfort, his eyes darting toward the window as though hoping Harlan Voss himself might materialize to save him from the conversation. "You understand," he said carefully, "that an accusation of this nature against a man like Voss is a serious matter." "I understand that a serious crime has been committed against my property," Maria said, "and I expect the law to treat it as such regardless of whose name sits beside it. I will need to see this for myself before I can act on any of it." "Then come and see," Simon said, "today, before the evidence has time to heal over and disappear entirely." Sheriff Tate rode out with them that same afternoon, along with a deputy named Frank Doolin, and though he clearly went with reluctance, once he laid eyes on the altered brands himself, his professional instincts overrode his fear of political consequence. For a lawman who ignored blatant brand theft, even from a wealthy man, risked his own reputation collapsing entirely should the truth come out later through other channels. "That is a Flameshoe brand beneath that circle V, plain as day," Tate admitted, studying the cattle closely. "Poorly done work, too. Whoever burned that second brand did it in a hurry." "What happens now?" Maria asked. "Now I pay Harlan Voss a visit," Tate said, though his voice carried little enthusiasm for the task. "And I expect there will be questions asked of his hired men as to who exactly drove these cattle and did this burning." The confrontation, when it came the following day, took place in the dusty yard outside the main house of the Voss Cattle Company, with Harlan Voss standing on his porch in a fine gray coat, his face reddening with fury as Sheriff Tate laid out the evidence before him. "You would take the word of a woman blacksmith over mine," Harlan demanded. "I have run cattle in this territory for 20 years, Tate. I built half this county with my own 2 hands." "I'm not taking anyone's word, Harlan," Tate said, though his voice wavered slightly under the weight of the older man's glare. "I am looking at branded cattle with my own eyes, and what I see is theft, clear as anything I have seen in 6 years wearing this badge." "Any fool with a wandering herd could claim theft," Harlan snapped. "Perhaps her cattle simply wandered onto my land, and my men, not knowing any better, branded them along with the rest before noticing the mistake." "That is a mighty convenient story," Simon said, unable to hold his tongue any longer. "For cattle to wander through a mended fence line that someone deliberately pried apart with tools, leaving nail marks that any blind man could see were not the work of wind or rain." Harlan's eyes flicked to Simon with open hatred. You would do well to remember your place, cowboy. You are a hired hand on Elias Prout's small spread, nothing more. This is a matter between the sheriff and myself. This is a matter of stolen cattle belonging to Mrs. Sawyer, Simon said evenly, refusing to be baited into the anger Harlan clearly hoped to provoke, and I intend to stand beside her until it is resolved fairly, whether that suits your notion of my place or not. It was Wendell Cross, arriving unexpectedly with two other small ranchers who had also grown weary of Voss's expanding influence over the years, who ultimately tipped the confrontation in Maria's favor. The three men had heard whispers of the dispute through the usual channels of gossip that traveled faster than any telegraph in a small territory, and they arrived prepared to testify that they, too, had experienced strange losses of cattle over recent months, losses they had been too intimidated to formally report given Voss's standing in the county. Faced with mounting witnesses and undeniable physical evidence, and unwilling to risk a formal trial that might expose the full extent of his methods, Harlan Voss was forced into a humiliating settlement. He returned all 7 of Maria's missing cattle, paid a fine to the county for the brand alteration, and Sheriff Tate, emboldened now by the visible support of multiple witnesses, made it plain that any further trouble involving Voss's men and Maria Sawyer's property would be pursued with the full weight of his office. It was not, by any measure, a total victory. Harlan Voss remained a powerful man, his ranch still the largest in the county, his influence still considerable in matters both large and small. But something had shifted in the balance of the territory that day. A quiet understanding among the smaller ranchers that a widow's brand had stood against the largest outfit in the region and had not been broken. The story spread quickly, as such stories do in small territories hungry for drama, and within weeks Maria Sawyer's name had become something spoken with a peculiar mixture of admiration and wariness. Every rancher in the county, it seemed, had heard some version of the tale, embellished here and there with each retelling, until the simple truth of a woman defending her small herd against theft had transformed into something closer to legend. "They are saying you faced down Harlan Voss with nothing but a branding iron and pure spite," Wendell Cross told her one afternoon, laughing as he relayed the latest version he had heard in the saloon. "Some fellow from Larkspur even claimed you threatened to brand Voss's own hide if he did not return your cattle." "I said no such thing," Maria said, though a small smile tugged at her mouth despite herself. "No, but I confess I did not correct the story too forcefully," Wendell admitted. It does the smaller ranchers good to believe someone finally stood up to that man and won. Every rancher feared it now, this new brand, this flameshoe mark that belonged to a widow who had once been dismissed as a temporary inconvenience, and had instead become something the entire territory watched with careful respect. Not fear born of cruelty, but fear born of the simple, unsettling knowledge that Maria Sawyer would not be moved, would not be frightened, would not sell her land or her shop or her herd, no matter how much pressure was brought to bear against her. Simon watched this transformation with a pride so fierce it sometimes stole his breath, and by the time autumn had settled fully over the territory, painting the cottonwoods along the creek bed gold and rust, he knew with complete certainty that he wanted to spend the rest of his life beside this woman, watching her forge whatever future she chose for herself. He asked her to marry him on a clear October evening, beside the very forge where they had first met, the fire banked low and warm behind them, the smell of coal smoke and autumn air mixing together, in a way that Simon would remember for the rest of his days. "I do not have much to offer you," he said, turning his hat over in his hands with a nervousness that seemed almost comical given how steady he had remained through every confrontation with Harlan Voss. "No land of my own, only what wages I have saved from years of hired work. But I have a strong back and a willing heart, and I would spend every day of my life helping you tend that herd and keep this shop running, if you would have me." Maria set down the horseshoe she had been shaping, the metal still glowing faintly orange in the dim light, and studied him for a long moment before answering. "Simon Wallace," she said, "you rode into my life with a lame horse and a quiet way of watching the world, and you have never once tried to tell me who I ought to be or what I ought to want. You have taught me cattle and stood beside me against a man who thought his wealth made him untouchable, and you have never asked me to be smaller than I am to make room for you." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the reflection of the forge fire dancing in her dark eyes. "I would be a fool to let a man like that walk away from me. Yes, Simon, I will marry you." They were wed 3 weeks later, on a bright, cold Sunday in early November, in the small white church at the edge of Cedar Hollow, with Wendell Cross standing as Simon's witness, and a gathering of townsfolk far larger than either of them had expected, many of them small ranchers who had come to see for themselves the marriage of the woman whose brand every rancher had learned to respect. Even Sheriff Tate attended, standing near the back with his hat in his hands, and though Harlan Voss was notably absent, several of his own former ranch hands had quietly left his employ in recent weeks, unsettled by the scandal of the brand theft, and drawn instead toward smaller outfits where a man's word still meant something. And a few of these men attended as well, curious to see the woman whose stubbornness had cost their former employer so dearly. The wedding itself was simple, as weddings in small frontier towns often were, but the joy in it was not simple at all. Maria wore a dress of pale blue cotton that she had sewn herself in the evenings after long days at the forge, and Simon wore his good coat, brushed and mended for the occasion, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the small church erupted into applause that seemed to shake the very rafters. Life settled into a new and steady rhythm after the wedding. Simon left his position at the Broken Wheel to work full-time alongside Maria, splitting his days between tending the growing herd, now expanded to 32 head through careful breeding and a few additional purchases funded by the shop's steady income, and helping at the forge itself, for though he was no smith by trade, he had learned enough in his months of visiting to be genuinely useful with the heavier work. They built a small house together on the land north of the shop, close enough to the grazing pasture that Maria could see her cattle from the kitchen window each morning, close enough to the forge that customers could still find her easily, and far enough from town that the evenings belonged entirely to the two of them, quiet and full of a contentment neither had expected to find so completely. The following spring brought new challenges, as frontier life always did. A harsh late frost threatened the herd, and Simon and Maria spent 3 sleepless nights moving cattle to sheltered ground, working side by side in the bitter cold until the danger passed. A wandering band of cattle rustlers, unconnected to Harlan Voss but drawn by rumors of the growing Flameshoe herd, attempted a raid one moonless night in April, only to be driven off by Simon's steady aim and Maria's fierce determination, neither of them willing to lose what they had built through months of careful labor. Harlan Voss himself made one final attempt at intimidation that same spring, sending word through an intermediary that he would offer a considerable sum for both the shop and the growing herd, a sum large enough that many would have found it difficult to refuse. Maria's answer, delivered through Wendell Cross with evident satisfaction, was simple and final. "Tell Mr. Voss," she said, "that the Flameshoe brand is not for sale now or ever, and that he would do well to spend his energy running his own ranch rather than coveting mine." Whether it was this final rebuff, or simply the accumulated weight of his declining reputation throughout the county, Harlan Voss's influence began a slow and steady decline over the following year. Several more of his hired men left his employ, drawn by tales of fair treatment on smaller ranches, and though his outfit remained large, it never again held quite the same fearsome grip over the smaller ranchers of Cedar Hollow. By the following autumn, in 1879, Maria Sawyer was known throughout the county not as the blacksmith's widow, a title that had once defined the entirety of her existence in the eyes of the town, but simply as Maria Wallace, proprietor of a thriving forge and owner of a respected cattle brand that had grown to nearly 60 head through careful management and honest hard work. The Flameshoe mark, once viewed with suspicion by ranchers uncertain what to make of a woman's ambition, had become instead a mark of quality and fair dealing, sought after by buyers who had learned that cattle bearing that brand were always healthy, always honestly raised, and never involved in the kind of underhanded dealings that still occasionally plagued the larger outfits in the territory. It was in the spring of 1880 that Maria discovered she was carrying their first child, a discovery that filled the small house north of town with a joy so complete that Simon found himself, more than once, simply standing in doorways watching his wife go about her daily work, overwhelmed by gratitude for a life he had never dared imagine for himself during his long years drifting alone across the plains. The pregnancy was not without difficulty, for Maria refused, even in her final months, to entirely give up her work at the forge, insisting that light hammering caused no harm and that idleness would drive her to distraction faster than any physical strain. Simon worried constantly, but he had learned by then that arguing with his wife on matters of her own capability was a battle he was destined to lose, and so instead he simply stayed close, taking on the heavier tasks himself and watching carefully for any sign that she needed rest. Their first child, a son, was born on a cold morning in January of 1881, delivered with the help of the town's aging doctor and a local midwife named Ruth Calloway, after a labor that lasted through most of the night and left Maria exhausted but triumphant. They named him Thomas, after the husband Maria had lost and never forgotten, a decision Simon supported without hesitation, understanding that love, properly understood, made room for all the people who had shaped a person's heart rather than demanding any of them be erased. "He has your eyes," Maria said, exhausted and glowing as she held their son for the first time while Simon sat beside the bed, unable to stop smiling despite the long, worried night behind him. "He has your stubbornness already," Simon replied, for the infant had screamed through most of his first hour of life with a determination that seemed to promise a formidable temperament in the years ahead. "I pity whichever cattle rustler tries to cross him someday." 2 years later, in 1883, a daughter followed, whom they named Grace, born in the same small house with considerably less drama than her older brother had provided, arriving on a warm summer morning with a quiet, contented temperament that immediately endeared her to everyone who met her. By this time, the Flameshoe Ranch had grown to nearly 150 head of cattle, managed jointly by Simon and Maria with the help of 2 hired hands they had taken on, as the operation expanded beyond what 2 people could reasonably manage alone. The forge continued to operate as well, though Maria had gradually shifted more of the daily smithing work to a young apprentice named Daniel Pierce, a local boy of 19 who had shown considerable aptitude for the trade, and whom Maria trained with the same patient, exacting standards her own late husband had once shown her. The town of Cedar Hollow itself had grown as well during these years, drawing new settlers eager to build lives in a territory that seemed, increasingly, to offer genuine opportunity rather than mere survival. Wyoming territory would not become a state for nearly another decade, but already the wildness of the earlier years was giving way to something more settled, more permanent, and Maria Wallace, formerly Sawyer, found herself regarded throughout the county as something of a founding figure in that transformation, a woman whose refusal to be diminished had helped shift, in some small but meaningful way, what the territory believed possible for those who had once been dismissed as too weak or too vulnerable to build something lasting on their own. Harlan Voss died in 1885 of a sudden apoplexy that struck him while inspecting his herds, and though there was little genuine mourning in Cedar Hollow, Maria surprised many by attending his funeral, standing quietly at the back of the small gathering with Simon at her side. "Why did you come?" Simon asked her afterward as they rode home together beneath a sky heavy with the promise of rain. "Because hatred is a heavy thing to carry, and I find I no longer wish to carry his," Maria said. "He tried to break me, and he failed, and in the end that failure is worth more to me than any satisfaction I might take from his death. I did not come to mourn him, Simon. I came to close a door that has been open too long." It was, Simon thought, exactly the kind of answer he had come to expect from his wife, practical and unsentimental on its surface, but carrying beneath it a depth of feeling that few people ever fully glimpsed unless they had earned the privilege of her trust. The years that followed brought their own share of both hardship and happiness, as frontier life always did. A drought in 1887 threatened the herd severely, forcing Simon and Maria to drive their cattle nearly 40 miles to find adequate grazing, a journey that tested both their partnership and their marriage, but ultimately left them more certain of each other than ever before. A third child, another son they named Elias in honor of the old rancher Elias Prout, who had given Simon his first employment in the territory, and had become, over the years, something of an honorary grandfather to their growing family, was born in 1888. Elias Prout himself lived to see this namesake grow into a sturdy toddler, before passing peacefully in his sleep in 1890, leaving behind a small parcel of land that he willed, to the surprise of many, but not to Simon and Maria themselves, entirely to the Wallace family, in recognition of the kindness and hard work they had shown him during his final years. This additional land allowed the Flameshoe Ranch to expand further still, and by the time the youngest of their children, a daughter named Sarah, born in 1892, had reached her own childhood, the ranch had grown to over 300 head of cattle, making it one of the more substantial operations in the county, though it never lost the personal, careful character that had defined it since Maria first sketched that horseshoe and flame in the dirt outside a county recorder's office. Simon named their youngest daughter Sarah at Maria's own suggestion, a gesture that moved him more deeply than he initially knew how to express, for it was the name of the girl he had once loved and lost in Kansas, and Maria's willingness to honor that old grief alongside her own showed him, in a way that words alone never quite could, the full generosity of the love she carried for him. "I did not want you to think any part of your heart needed to be hidden from me," Maria told him, when he finally found the words to thank her for the gesture. "We have both loved before, Simon, and lost people we loved, and I think that is nothing to be ashamed of or buried away. It only means we understand, better than most, how precious what we have found together truly is." The forge itself remained in operation for the rest of Maria's working life, eventually passed on to Daniel Pierce, her former apprentice, who ran it with the same honest standards his teacher had instilled in him, and who, in a quiet echo of the story that had shaped so much of Maria's own life, eventually married a young schoolteacher named Emily Hastings, who had come to Cedar Hollow to teach at the small schoolhouse that had been built as the town continued to grow. Maria Wallace lived to see her children grown, her eldest son Thomas taking over management of the cattle operation, alongside his father as Simon's own hands grew less steady with age, her daughter Grace marrying a young doctor and moving to a growing town further west, her second son Elias becoming a respected horse breeder whose stock was known throughout the territory for its quality, and her youngest daughter Sarah eventually taking up her mother's old trade at the forge, learning smithing from Daniel Pierce himself, and carrying the Sawyer family skill forward into a new generation. On quiet evenings in their later years, Simon and Maria often sat together on the porch of the house they had built so many decades before, watching the sun set over land that bore their brand, the same Flameshoe mark that had once made every rancher in the county wary, now simply a mark of quiet respect and honest dealing that had outlasted the man who had once tried so hard to see it destroyed. "Do you ever regret it?" Simon asked her once when they were both well into their 60s, their hair gone entirely gray, their hands showing the wear of decades of honest labor. The forge, the herd, all of it. It would have been an easier life, perhaps, if you had simply sold to Voss all those years ago. Maria considered the question for a long moment, watching their grandchildren playing in the yard below, the sound of their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "I have thought about that sometimes," she admitted. "How much simpler things might have been. But I do not think I would trade this life, Simon, not for all the simplicity in the world. I forged something here, something that was entirely my own, something no one could take from me because I built it with my own two hands and refused to let anyone tell me I was not capable of the work. And in doing that, I found you." She reached over and took his weathered hand in hers, the same hand that had once been so young and uncertain, standing in the doorway of her forge with a limping horse and a quiet, watchful way about him. "I would forge that same brand 1,000 times over, Simon Wallace, if it meant finding my way back to you each time." Simon lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, weathered now with age but still bearing, faintly, the small crescent-shaped scar she had earned in those early, uncertain months after Thomas Sawyer's death, when she had first decided that she would rather ruin her hands than ruin her pride. "I would ride into that same town 1,000 times over as well," he said, "lame horse and all, simply for the chance to watch you work that forge one more time." They sat together as the sun sank fully behind the mountains, two people who had built a life neither could have imagined alone, bound together by a love that had grown slowly and steadily, like iron shaped patiently over a forge fire, tempered by hardship and made stronger for it. A love that had, in the end, proven far more enduring than any threat Harlan Voss or the harsh territory itself had ever managed to level against them. The Flameshoe brand remained registered in the county for generations after, passed down eventually to Thomas Wallace and his own children, a lasting testament to a widow who had once stood alone against a rancher who believed his wealth entitled him to whatever he desired, and who had instead built something so solid, so honestly earned, that it outlasted every attempt to break it. And in the small cemetery behind the Cedar Hollow Church, where Thomas Sawyer had been laid to rest so many years before, two more graves eventually stood beside newer markers, side by side beneath the same wide Wyoming sky, marking the final resting place of Simon Wallace and Maria Wallace, husband and wife for over 40 years, who had built a life together out of iron and stubbornness, and a love that neither time nor cruelty had ever managed to diminish. Their story became, in time, something told and retold throughout the county, much as the original tale of the brand theft had once spread from mouth to mouth in the saloons and general stores of the territory, though the later tellings focused less on the conflict with Harlan Voss and more on the simple, enduring truth at the heart of it all. That a woman who refused to be broken by grief or intimidation had found, in her own fierce independence, not isolation but the deepest kind of partnership, and that a quiet cattleman who had once believed his own capacity for love had been spent and lost in Kansas had found it again, whole and abundant, in the person of a blacksmith's widow who forged her own brand and never once apologized for the fear it inspired in men who deserved to feel it.